This channel is part of the History Hit network. Stick around to find out more.
The history of aggression in the Pacific world is a long and bloody one. The success of the Japanese armies in Manchuria helped strengthen the Japanese militarist clique, which celebrated the birth of what was piously called an independent nation. The Japanese installed the opportunistic Bouyi as chief executive of the newly proclaimed nation. But actually, Manchukuo was nothing more than a puppet state, whose destinies were firmly controlled from Japan. This high-handed seizure of Manchuria was taken under consideration by another body of nations dedicated to preventing aggression, the League of Nations. Japan's delegate Matsuoka protested his country's innocence.
It is a matter of common knowledge that Japan's policy is fundamentally inspired by a genuine desire to guarantee peace in the Far East and to contribute to the maintenance of peace throughout the world. Japan, however, finds it impossible to accept the report adopted by the Assembly.
Japan subsequently withdrew from the League of Nations. That body proved itself incapable of stemming the tide of aggression, either in Europe or in Asia. It was inevitable that the Japanese militarists should one day turn their attention southward toward China. In 1937, China's large coastal cities came under attack. In China, Japan's pattern for conquest was firmly established. The Chinese became the first refugees of the struggle which was to grow into the Second World War. Shanghai fell to the aggressors in November 1937, and the Japanese tightened their grip on the mainland of Asia. 4 years later, Japan's program of aggression in the Pacific had grown to staggering proportions. From a point 300 miles off Oahu, Japanese planes took off on the strike which marked the start of World War II in the Pacific. The crippling of the U.S. Pacific Fleet in the Pearl Harbor attack left the United States with only a small naval force in fighting condition. The careful employment of that inadequate complement of ships was the job of Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet. The Navy's battered Pacific Fleet was all that stood between the enemy and further amphibious conquests. The U.S. Navy won 2 great victories during the first half of 1942. Victories which proved turning points in the war against Japan. In June, after the U.S. fleet had won the first round in an engagement with a powerful enemy naval force in the Coral Sea, the 2 large fleets met again off Midway Island. As in the Coral Sea battle, the naval engagement at Midway was primarily an air action. Warfare took a new turn in early 1942 in the Pacific. and American carrier planes, reinforced by land-based Marine and Army planes from Midway, dealt the enemy a crushing defeat. The U.S. Navy had paid back the Japanese for Pearl Harbor.
If you love history, then you'll love History Hit. We have tons of exclusive documentaries about the most important people in history that you will not find anywhere else. Whether it's exploring the ruins and secrets of the Second World War, or rediscovering lost stories from the front of the First World War, there is a war story waiting for you on History Hit. With an unrivaled catalogue of military history documentaries, it is a must-have for any lover of history. Not only that, but we have a huge podcast network releasing new episodes every day, so you'll always have something to listen to. Sign up now for a 14-day free trial, and War Stories fans get 50% off their first 3 months. Just be sure to use the code WARSTORIES at checkout.
In those early months of war in the Pacific, American fighting forces were woefully understrength, ill-prepared for the job of stopping the Japanese advances. In the Aleutians, which lie between North America and Japan's home islands, the U.S. garrisons were particularly undermanned. American air units were severely handicapped by the unpredictable weather and by the generally difficult terrain. Each time a plane left its base, even on a routine flight, there was a strong feeling of uncertainty about its safe return. Though contact with the enemy was limited in the Aleutians, it was of the most vital importance to the United States to keep the enemy from advancing along the island chain toward the American mainland. Southward, the job of containing the enemy advance was quite a different problem. In the jungles of New Guinea, Allied soldiers fought a determined campaign, helped materially by friendly natives, to keep the enemy from seizing control of the entire island and broadening the area of South Pacific conquests. The Aussies quickly became acclimated to fighting in the mountainous jungle territory. But getting at the enemy in that country was a slow business. Advances in the malaria-ridden jungle were made tortuously. Though the Aussies sometimes felt they'd been forgotten, there was evidence from time to time that they weren't really isolated after all. And as the Allies seized the offensive, the foot soldiers were supported in increasing numbers by new bombers, which gave the enemy a sample of things to come. On a tiny coral atoll named Tarawa in November 1943, the United States opened a new assault toward Japan from another direction. One division of Marines, the 2nd, was assigned the task of reducing this enemy stronghold. Tarawa was one of the most heavily fortified positions in Japan's outer defense ring. The 76-hour battle for that atoll assumed epic proportions. The Marines' casualties were heavy, but a most valuable piece of land had been taken from the enemy. Tarawa was a platform from which the American offensive in the Central Pacific would be continued, driving closer and closer to the main target, Japan itself. The Asiatic Pacific theater extended westward as far as India and encompassed the rugged, spectacular Himalayan country. The sprawling China-Burma India area was one of the most confused commands of World War II. One of its few notable achievements was the building of the Lido Road under the direction of General Vinegar Joe Stilwell, commander of U.S. and Chinese forces. In the CBI, the ultimate target, Japan itself was as remote as the moon. The war, as it was fought in the CBI, was marred by jealousies and lack of cooperation among the command, a condition which was generally reflected in the dispirited performance of Allied fighting men. Fortunately, the campaign in the CBI consisted of a series of marginal actions, virtually unrelated to the broader war. The assault against the enemy's inner defense ring at Saipan and the Marianas came as a great shock to Japan. For this mountainous island, the heart of Japan's South Seas empire, was within striking distance of Tokyo. The fight for Saipan was one of the toughest of the Pacific War. At Saipan, the Marines and soldiers who made the assault suffered some 14,000 casualties, 3,000 dead in the 25-day battle. Still farther west, an invasion of the Philippines was made at Leyte Island. With the assault on the Philippines by American GIs who had driven north and west through the New Guinea jungles, a promise made 2.5 years earlier was kept.
2 years ago, I said to the people of the Philippines whence I came, I shall return. I repeat those words. I shall return. Nothing is more certain than the ultimate reconquest and liberation from the enemy of those and adjacent lands.
America's newest long-range bombers, the powerful B-29s, took off on missions over the Japanese homeland beginning in late 1944. The trip from bases in the Japan and return totaled some 2,500 miles, just about all of it over water. No other heavy bombers in any theater had such an assignment. Finally, after 7 hours, the enemy's homeland lay just ahead. The enemy began to have some doubts about the invincibility of the Japanese war machine. The effect on Japanese morale was incalculable. Inevitably, the submarine was destined to play an important part in the Navy's war in the Pacific. Throughout the war, the exploits of American subs were generally classed as secret for security reasons. But their achievements, though unpublicized, were notable.
Down periscope.
During World War II, U.S. subs accounted for 63% of the total of Japanese merchant shipping sunk in the Pacific, and nearly a third of the enemy's combat ships sent to the bottom. Once more, in early 1945, a small, heavily defended island fortress had to be taken. And once more, the job fell to the Marines. The assault on Iwo Jima was one of the bloodiest chapters in Marine Corps history. 3 divisions of Marines inched forward in the face of heavy fire from a thoroughly dug-in enemy. The battle for this inferno of 8 square miles raged for 26 days. 26 days of continuing bitter fighting. The Marines lost 5,000 dead and 17,000 wounded, but the rocky island was in American hands. In April 1945, an assault was made against an enemy-held stronghold even closer to Japan, at Okinawa. Offshore, kamikaze attacks on American ships by enemy suicide pilots reached a final frenzied peak. Navy lost 36 ships off Okinawa. More than 350 more were damaged. Casualties were heavy. The Navy alone lost nearly 5,000 men killed and almost that many more wounded. But U.S. forces had successfully fought their way to the shore of Japan itself. In the 7 divisions of soldiers and Marines on Okinawa, there were nearly 40,000 casualties, 7,000 of them dead. With Japan bracing itself for an invasion of its homeland, a different kind of attack provided a terrifying conclusion to World War II. At Hiroshima, Japan, on August 6, 1945, the world moved into a new era, in which the threat of possible destruction of the planet Earth hung menacingly over it from that day onward. Less than a month later, in Tokyo Bay, on board the U.S. battleship Missouri, the formal surrender of Japan was made to officers of the Allied governments engaged in the war against that nation. General of the Army Douglas MacArthur presided at the ceremony.
We are gathered here, representatives of the major warring powers, to conclude a solemn agreement whereby peace may be restored. It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past. I now invite the representatives of the Emperor of Japan and the Japanese government and the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters to sign the instrument of surrender at the places indicated.
The once arrogant Japanese, whose aggressive sweep across the Pacific had been begun less than 4 years earlier, had finally been brought to bay. The ceremony on the Missouri concluded the most costly war the world had ever known, fought over an expanse of hundreds of thousands of miles. On that cloudy September morning in Tokyo Bay, it seemed that a lasting peace had surely been brought to the Pacific and to the world.
Let us pray that peace be now restored to the world, and that God will preserve it always. These proceedings are closed.
The enemy was finally completely defeated. The future of Japan was now the concern of the Allies, and particularly of the United States. The administration of Japan in the years directly following the end of World War II was firm and efficient. The American Army supervised the operation of the conquered country, assisted by Japanese who had been classed as trustworthy helpers for the overtaxed Americans. Under the guidance of American occupation personnel, the people of Japan quickly learned the mechanics of democracy. Despite the dislocation of its national attitude, the country rapidly recovered its composure. But before 5 years had passed, a new aggressor put an end to peace in the Pacific. The North Korean invasion of South Korea in June 1950 had far greater implications than the Japanese attack on Manchuria 19 years before. Acting with the endorsement of the United Nations, the United States quickly went to the defense of South Korea. But American forces in the Far East were limited in strength, and most of the troops were inexperienced. Through the summer of 1950, American GIs fought on courageously against overwhelming odds. At headquarters of the United Nations, the Korean fighting won top priority on the discussion agenda.
The Soviet delegate referred several times to, quote, the aggression of which the United States is guilty against the Korean people, end quote. This statement has been repeated over and over through every Soviet-inspired channel on Earth. We've had it telegraphed to us by others, and we've heard it again today. It is a lie. It is a big lie.
The debate continued through the summer.
Who then is supporting the United Nations Charter and working for peace? The 53 members of the United Nations who are assisting the Republic of Korea. Is the Soviet Union one of the 53? No.
By August 1950, the other free nations of the world were sending troops to the support of South Korea. Britain sent 13,000 soldiers to join U.S. troops in the lines. The UN forces were further swelled by the arrival of 5,000 Filipino soldiers. Most of the nations which had fought in the Pacific War sent troops to South Korea. Australia's diggers, who had fought so well in the steaming jungles of New Guinea, arrived to battle under the UN banner. But the bulk of the fighting forces in the lines against the communists in Korea were American troops. As the tide of battle swept down into South Korea, then north almost to the border of Manchuria, then south again, and finally north across the 38th parallel once more, U.S. soldiers and Marines fought savagely to demonstrate beyond any doubt that the U.S. is prepared to stand behind the UN in resisting the aggressor. The path of aggression led once again to the same inglorious end. The North Koreans and Chinese Reds who surrendered to UN forces were far smaller in number than those who were killed while attempting to drive the UN forces off the Korean peninsula. In its predatory invasion of South Korea, the enemy suffered roughly 1 million casualties. Finally, just 1 year after the invasion of South Korea, Soviet delegate to the UN, Yakov Malik, indicated that perhaps the wind from the east was shifting.
The Soviet people believed that as a first step, discussions should be started between the belligerents for a ceasefire and an armistice, providing for the mutual withdrawal of forces from the 38th parallel. Can such a step be taken? I think it can, provided there is a sincere desire to put an end to the bloody fighting in Korea.
But whether the world was technically at peace or a limited war was being fought on some far-flung battlefield, The people of the United States realized that their country must be stronger than ever before if the ultimate war of world destruction was to be avoided. In the Pacific, on Eniwetok Atoll, the strength to resist any aggressor was being developed to the utmost. On the efforts of the men occupied there depended the life or death of the free world. In the 19th century, Herman Melville wrote of the Pacific,
"There is, one knows not what sweet mystery about this sea, whose gently awful stirrings seem to speak of some hidden soul beneath. This mysterious, divine Pacific zones the world's whole bulk about, makes all coasts one bay to it, seems the tide-beating heart of earth."
In this 20th century, the world is growing more and more aware of this strategic area, once explored by Magellan and Cook, and immortalized by Stevenson and Conrad. And now these once remote lands are covered with the evidences of modern history. The tie between the Pacific world and the United States, first established by the visits to the Orient of Yankee merchant ships, has grown increasingly strong through the years. Today, the affairs of this republic and the Pacific world are inextricably interwoven. A modern author, James A. Michener, has written of this mighty sea.
Our men lie buried there. Our ships and planes are in its bosom, and I am convinced that along its shores will be determined the precise quality of our future.
The war which engulfed the Pacific in 1941 marked the beginning of a new era in the history of that part of the earth. Never again could the Pacific Basin remain detached from the forces which were shaping the course of world history. The first truly global war brought to the Pacific the look of destruction and the smell of death, already familiar in other parts of the earth. The word Pacific no longer meant an ocean paradise of peace. For countless centuries, the peoples of the Pacific were largely untroubled by international crises. Life was simple for the natives of most of the lands touched by the world's largest ocean. It once seemed wildly improbable that the people of these remote regions and the exotic lands they inhabited would one day be swept into the main current of the Earth's affairs. The United States first became vitally interested in the Pacific world following the extension of America's frontiers westward. In the mid-19th century, the young republic pushed its way across the 3,000 miles separating its east and west coasts. The attention of pioneering America was focused on the territory which lay along the western shores of the continent. With the acquisition of Oregon and California, the United States became an important force in the affairs of the Pacific world. But the coastline did not check America's expansion westward. The same spirit which motivated the exploration of the western United States prompted other Americans, men like Secretary of State William H. Seward, to extend the range of American influence into the Pacific Basin itself. With the purchase of Alaska from Russia in 1867, the United States gained a bastion from which control of the North Pacific area could be effected. America's new territory was rugged, magnificent country. For well over a century, this land had been ruled by the demands of the Russian fur trade. No serious attempt at colonization and development had been made by its former owner. In the early days of U.S. control, Alaska was a land of opportunity to a number of Americans who had failed in their attempt to make a fortune, but who still hoped to succeed one day. The discovery of gold in Alaska in the 1880s provided a strong incentive for Americans to migrate to the new territory. An orderly system of land surveys was inaugurated before the turn of the century, and a succession of homestead laws became effective. But in spite of Alaska's natural advantages, the development of the new territory was a slow process. Attempts to speed up colonization were hampered by the frequently unfavorable climate. In many parts of Alaska, the weather was suitable for outdoor work for only a brief period each year. Early in the 20th century, work was begun on the Alaska Railway, which upon completion was to cover 500 miles of territory. But despite these intimations of progress, Alaska remained a sprawling, undeveloped outpost, whose new residents were clustered in a few towns along its southern shore. To the south, the Hawaiian Islands became a link in America's Pacific frontier in the closing years of the 19th century. Hawaii lies directly in the path of the trade winds. Its soft, provocative climate helps make it one of the most popular of American possessions. Hawaii today is dotted with evidences of its colorful history. Its discoverer, Britain's Captain James Cook, is commemorated on the island of Hawaii. And the memory of the reign of King Kamehameha I is kept vividly alive throughout the islands. This popular monarch, revered by the islanders as the Napoleon of the Pacific, fostered a closer relationship with the United States. Hawaiians are a happy, hospitable people. Today, the Polynesian strain, in its pure form, is not as prevalent as it was in former years, due to years of intermarriage with other racial groups. Ancient Polynesian customs are still celebrated in much the same spirit their ancestors observed in the days before the coming of the white man several generations ago. All the islanders of whatever racial stock revel in the native ceremonies. But life in Hawaii also has its modern commercial side. Honolulu, the crossroads of the Pacific, is the business hub of the Hawaiian archipelago. For many years, a few principal industries supported most of the Hawaiian population. Hawaii's increasing development and continued prosperity are associated directly with the size and quality of its crops of pineapple and sugarcane, the island's chief exports. Technical improvements in growing cane and extracting the sugar content have made the Hawaiian industry a more efficient operation than any of its mainland competitors. But Hawaii's principal industry was destined soon to be war work. Home base of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, Hawaii assumed a tremendous importance as a U.S. war with Japan became a distinct possibility. Strategically situated almost midway between the American mainland and the home islands of Japan, Hawaii would inevitably be directly concerned if war broke out. With the tension in the Pacific increasing, Army units continued their rehearsals for a defense of the Hawaiian Islands against a possible enemy attack. To the west, in the far reaches of the Pacific, the United States acquired a valuable Far Eastern outpost in Guam in 1898, following the war with Spain. For many years, the new American territory retained its largely primitive complexion. Habits of life passed along from generation to generation were not quickly altered. When Trans-Pacific Plane Service was established in 1936, Guam was made a regular stop, and the island became an even more important link in the chain of American possessions in the Pacific Basin. And it was quite apparent that the U.S. recognized its importance. American rule was strict but paternalistic. The governor and his associates were Navy officers appointed to their posts, and the affairs of the island were regulated in precise military fashion. In 40 years, the Guamanian population increased from 9,000 to 22,000, a rise which can be directly attributed to public health measures initiated by the Navy. Guam was predominantly Catholic, like the Philippines, also wrested from Spanish rule by the U.S. at the end of the 19th century. In the Guamanians, the United States had gained an intensely loyal people. Under American rule, the people were classed as nationals, but were not granted the privileges of citizens of the United States. Most Guamanians, whose lives had improved somewhat in recent years, looked hopefully toward the day when they might attain the status of full U.S. citizenship. The U.S. was not the only great power gaining a foothold in the Pacific. In a strategic position in the southwestern region lie two important members of the British Commonwealth of Nations, Australia and New Zealand. These down-under countries have made Great Britain a more active participant in the affairs of the Pacific for the past several generations. The modern cities of the two lands today are inhabited by the descendants of the British settlers who migrated to British Oceania. This thoroughly Occidental society developed and flourished, though it was more than 10,000 miles removed from the mother country, almost halfway around the globe. Today, Australia and New Zealand are autonomous communities within the British family of nations. An industrious and progressive people, Australians and New Zealanders show an obvious pride in the steady growth of their countries. Although both nations have made considerable progress in developing their rich agricultural resources, there is still room for expansion, particularly in New Zealand and in the reclamation of Australian badlands. Both down-under countries exist on an export economy, for even if the purchasing power of the Australian and New Zealander were substantially increased, they could not possibly consume the enormous meat and dairy yield. The livelihood of both Australians and New Zealanders has been dependent directly on Britain's purchases of their produce. As these purchases fall off, Australia and New Zealand are confronted with the problem of finding and expanding new markets. For the problem of developing independent economies successfully could be solved only by the two dominions themselves. But while the bonds of empire were no longer as strong in a material and political sense, the spiritual tie between the dominions and the seat of the British Commonwealth of Nations remained as firm as ever. For centuries, the countries of Southeast Asia have constituted a potential trouble spot in the Pacific world. In the 30s, the stirrings of nationalism became evident in these heavily populated countries, peopled by a great variety of ethnic groups. Siam began to agitate for the return of territory allegedly usurped by the French in the 19th century. Its people dreamed of a greater Thailand, and a close bond was established with the Japanese, who sided with the Siamese in their modest territorial expansion program. Hub of the Oriental world for thousands of years, China held a dominant position in the Pacific Basin throughout most of the 19th century. China's principal point of contact with the outside world for almost 100 years was Shanghai, where British business interests first established a foothold. The economic life of all of China was related directly to the business affairs of China's large coastal population centers. Whoever controlled China's port cities exercised a powerful influence on the country's overall economic structure. The westernization of China's population centers had a profound effect on the country as a whole. China's principal cities in the 20th century had a decidedly Occidental cast. The lives of a considerable percentage of China's population were directly affected by the beginnings of the machine age in China. One of the most important aspects of China's modernization was the introduction of progressive methods in the manufacture of textiles. But modern methods prevailed only in a few major cities. Throughout most of China, traditional procedures were still followed. For even in the 20th century, China remained thoroughly Oriental in the conduct of its affairs. Many Chinese merchants still transacted their business chiefly in the local tea house. All classes of Chinese men enjoyed the luxury of spending a few hours at the tea house, where the patrons discussed all their problems, social as well as business, with anyone who cared to listen. Through the years, the local tea house became an informal extension of the magistrate's court. China's mode of life bore many striking resemblances to the manners of earlier generations. China's fortunes took an abrupt turn in 1911, when the Chinese Empire was overthrown by supporters of Dr. Sun Yat-sen, on whose political principles the young republic was founded. A disciple of Dr. Sun, Chiang Kai-shek dedicated himself to the task of extending the revolution throughout China. America's interest in China, which dates back a number of generations, increased steadily through the early years of the 20th century. The men of the U.S. Asiatic Fleet became familiar figures in all China's coastal cities. To many of the men, China provided the best liberty ports in the Eastern Hemisphere, if not in the world. And business was always good when the fleet was in. The regular visits of U.S. warships were made chiefly for diplomatic reasons. The appearance of a cruiser like the Augusta, even on a friendly call, could hardly fail to leave a vivid impression of U.S. military capabilities. But there were other visitors in China's harbors. Japanese warships, ignoring diplomacy, simply occupied China's key ports. For the center of influence in the Orient was shifting to the north and east. Japan was taking a more and more active part in Far Eastern affairs. The rise of the Japanese nation as a world power was closely linked with the religious convictions of its people. For the Japanese believed that they were ordained by the gods to grow sufficiently strong to rule the earth one day. Much of the ritual was dedicated by the Japanese Shinto priests to the interests of the imperial government. In these ceremonies, the people celebrated their national unity, their patriotism, their prosperity, the seasons of the year, the abundance of their crops, and any other aspects of their national life which seemed fitting. The principal aims of the state Shinto cult were to obtain support for the state, effect national solidarity, and create strength in critical periods. To the Occidental, the Japanese concept of existence was difficult to understand. In fact, until the mid-19th century, Japan and its people were virtually a complete mystery to the world at large. The home islands of Japan proper, although not large in total area, have supported a population of millions throughout recorded history. Every available square foot of land was carefully developed to provide the people with enough food for a bare existence. The basic social unit in Japan is the family, whose members have grown accustomed to living frugally. In the face of hardship, the Japanese have long been a stoic race. Women had a humble status in the Japanese household. But among the poorer classes, the differences in social standing were less rigid. From the earliest years of Nipponese history, the men have been great fishermen. The export of marine products has been a thriving industry since Nippon resumed contact with the outside world. During the early decades of the 20th century, Japan stepped up the development of all her industries. Foreign influences had a considerable effect in the shaping of modern Japan. Life in her large cities came to bear some resemblance to that in Occidental commercial centers. The reorganization of the currency system in the late 19th century eliminated the confusion resulting from the use of several types of money. A stabilized banking system provided evidence to the public of the strength and efficiency of the government administration. Although it took some time to achieve the readjustment from the old way of operating, the conversion to modern methods was made rapidly once the nation's business with foreign countries increased. The telephone, introduced in Japan in 1877, helped materially in bringing the country back into the orbit of world affairs. With their typical enthusiasm for anything new, the people soon became addicted to the use of the mystifying gadget. Once begun, the westernization of the home islands of Japan quickly gained momentum. As soon as they had become aware of what life was like outside their country, the Japanese addressed themselves to the task of imitating that life wherever possible. Once completely secluded, the Japanese now seemed obsessed with the desire to prove themselves as progressive as any people, any place in the world. But this craze for Western ideas did not completely transform Japan. Its cultural life remained virtually unaffected by Western influences. In the Western world's 20th century after Christ, Japan stood at the threshold of a new era. The cult of emperor worship was appropriated by a small but powerful militarist clique, which adopted the doctrine of extending Japan's borders by force if necessary. As the militarists gained greater control, all Japan was geared to the new program of expansion by aggression, and the energies of all Japanese were directed toward the building of a strong national fighting spirit.